A few years ago, I worked as an officer in the Kitay-Gorod IAB. In this connection, I would like to tell you about an incident that I was present at when I testified. It was in early June 2000s. I was on 24-hour duty. The neighborhood in terms of ordinary crime was pretty quiet. Hooliganism, petty theft were in vogue. There were murders, but mostly business/political, all kinds of bribery. We had 3 GMR cars in the neighborhood, and this story started with one of them. 3:30 in the morning, a call, one of the groups. Go to Solyanka. We drove off, the second officer, me and 3 other employees. 3 minutes later, we're there. A woman, 30 years old approximately, dressed decently, Muscovite according to the documents, alive. In one piece, apart from 2 scratches, standing, crying, mumbling something. Sober. Serge and I, the second cop, and Andrei, the eldest of the group, come up with questions and reassurance. We sat down, started writing, dropped it, started again, from scratch. Then we quit again. Because it doesn't work like that, she said. It was a hell of a thing. And we don't write bloody things, that's usually the doctor's problem. But it turned out like this. She and her husband left the restaurant on Pokrovka at 23:00. The car was abandoned not far away in the alley. The exact name does not remember. She remembers visually how to go. The evening has fallen. The alleys are empty. It's quite a funny neighborhood. The streets are lively. And in many alleys there are uninhabited, boarded-up one-story buildings. By the time we got there, the time is 23:30. Here near one of the structures they hear wild infernal screams from the building. She feels uncomfortable, and Lesha, that was her husband's name, tries to rush to the rescue. And how? It is unclear. The building is boarded up. The windows are boarded up. The doors are not visible. The entrance is from the yard. They run into the yard. She wails, "Lesha, let's call the police." And he is heroic for some reason. Until they come, they will commit a crime 10 times and run away. So at least we'll scare them away. Here's the door. It's unlocked. She noticed that the door was covered with some newspapers. The screams are gone. Cautiously stepping inside, eyes unseeing, she stays on the porch. Suddenly, there is a shriek from her husband, and some sobbing or chawing. Yes, that's exactly what she said. CHAWKII. We asked back 2 times. After 5 seconds, the clap, back forward the husband flies out. His hand is bloody, his jacket is gone. All white, shaking, but seemingly alive. Grabs her hand, shouts, "Run." They run. Where to? Why? They don't understand. They lost their car. They got confused in the alley. There are no people. They take a cell phone instead of the standard MTS. Adokard, or something like that. Some kind of gibberish. They dial 02. They get squeaks and words in an incomprehensible language. 112. Same thing. They panic. They run. They run into some dead end. She remembers the name. It's quiet. It's deserted. It's dark. What? Wakate's there. How are you? She shouts to him. He's silent in a stupor, says he doesn't remember, says he has to find a car and drive. She cries, doesn't understand what or how. Suddenly some kind of vibration in the ground begins. Must be the subway, she says. Yes, her husband agrees, but starts to shake. He grabs her hand like a pincer, and they run to the exit of the dead end. Stay here. I'll come out and see what's going on, he tells her. Takes a step around the corner. She rushes after him, but he's no. Just no. Straight empty street. In those 3/4 seconds it was impossible to hide. She screams, calls, cries, wails, thinks it's a ridiculous prank. But he's no. Wandered, then suddenly came upon people, asked them to help, but they recoiled like a sick person. Eventually she came to Solyanka, and here she was spotted by our guy's car. She was begging us to find him. We'd love to, but how? According to the rules, 3 days. She hasn't seen the crime. It doesn't make sense. All right, let's quit writing and go check out the scene. We found the house. Void Dead End, or Void on the maps of Moscow is not, and with a similar name in the neighborhood is not. We examined the building. Empty, dusty old. The only thing, the door is not pasted with newspapers, swears that it was. Strange, of course. Even more interesting with the jacket. They found it. The remnants. Actually, it was lying on the other side. A dusty piece. No traces of blood or foreign matter, but only half of it. Cut diagonally with something strange, like a razor. We couldn't find the other half. We found the car. It was standing there. Really, no marks or damage. We call her sober driver. Let her drive. The aunt is clearly not inadequate to drive herself. We take explanations from her. She writes a statement. We decided to leave it as it is, only calmed it a little. We are standing, smoking, with the assistant of the chief on duty, an old fat captain. He was a huge man, old school. He's retired now, but he was a good man then. I asked him what he thought. He took a drag, looked at me and said, "What's the name of the dead end?" "Void Dead End, or Void Dead End," I said. "That's a strange name. There's no such thing." He took another drag, coughed, and replied, "Dig through the old files in my safe. There's a selection of one from the archives. There are several cases like that in there. Disappearances, too. There was another one who didn't disappear, but survived, talking some nonsense about having found a road worse than the one he'd found. The doctors took him away afterwards, but in general, I didn't observe the system then. It was a quarter of a century ago. But now I've been observing it for a long time, and I try not to go down the old Chinatown alleys." He put it out and went into the building. In general, it's worth saying separately about missing people. People don't just disappear like that. People disappear, but then they are found. Usually in the spring, resurfaced. And usually a person has a backstory. Environment, a narc, or something else. Occupation, a private lender, and so on. But that's so. An ordinary man in the center of a busy city in front of his wife vanished into thin air. There are almost no such stories. Almost. I dug into the file cabinet. I found 8 other cases involving Void Dead End. Also missing, abandoned cases everywhere. No one was going to look for them. No one. And nowhere, it seems. At least, not on our map, not in our earthly cities. I also talked to colleagues from other departments later. There is almost nowhere else like this. Sometimes old-timers tell me something like that, at the level of stories, but I didn't believe it before. I thought it was just old people talking. But suddenly, I became a direct participant myself, and I began to treat these stories a little differently. Since then, I try not to walk in the center in nooks and crannies with abandoned buildings. It's not for nothing that they're still standing there.
Next story.
Oh, my youth. In the Ninities they opened discos, and my parents were strict. They wouldn't let me go anywhere. The time was hungry. I learned how to cut hair and worked part-time as a hairdresser on weekends, but I couldn't go to my friend's datka or to a disco at school. I lived on the first floor, through the window and out. That's how I got out that time, too, which I want to tell you about. My friends were waiting for me. The disco was not far away, but these places were unfamiliar to me. There was nothing fun there, but I don't know why. If the question, did you go to the 8th grade party? You had nothing to say. The only option was to shoot yourself like a disgraced nobleman. The girls escorted me to the bus stop, explained where to get off, and left with the gentleman. While I was waiting for the bus, it was already midnight. Let me explain that I always took a different route closer to home. When I got off the bus, I looked around. No one, just a lonely stall. When I wanted to cross the road, I noticed a big man in a dark raincoat, standing there as if hiding in the shadows. I got a bad feeling. I was afraid to go through the dark courtyard. I thought I'd wait for him to leave. He noticed my confusion and went the other way, and after a little while he turned around. But I didn't move. We stood like that for a long time, and at some point I saw that he was gone, so I rushed out. I went into the courtyard, and he came out of the ground. To my left was an abandoned construction site, next to the house. The entrances were overgrown with forest. Our city was not in vain nicknamed the City of Broken Lanterns. They really 1 in 10 were burning. I ran, and he followed me. Turning around, I saw him put his hand behind his back and pull out a knife. Don't yell or scream. It's the 90s. No one will come out. Probably the knife and interfered with his running. But he would catch up. One hope. Some dogman might come out in the backyard at night. I'm running and hoping. I wish the dogman would come out. And lo and behold, there's a guy with a white hood visible from behind the trees, standing at the front door, letting his dog down and standing there. Then my voice broke through and I shouted, "Fedka, you bastard. We agreed at the bus stop. And he's here. I'll show you. Take Killer on a leash. There's a man here. Killer, Killer, come here." I turned around, and the maniac was running away. I think I'm gonna grab the dog man. Walk me home. I saw him leaving, so I ran faster, and when I got to the front door, and the trees stopped obstructing my view, I saw that there was no dogman there. There was a transparent white something hanging above the ground, as if you cover a person with a sheet. The only thing that scared me was that the maniac would come back. I started walking backwards and said, "I wish you'd walk me out." And it began to hover in the air at a distance of 3 to 4 meters behind me. And I complained aloud that the maniac could make a circle and come back, but after walking a bit, it stopped. The persuasion to go further did not work, and I ran home. It turned out my dad was waiting for me at another stop. A week passed, and I went to give a haircut to a young family living in that house, and they decided to pick me up. We had been friends for a long time, and it was not without tea. Over a friendly chat, I told them everything, and I was bombarded with questions. Which front door? Where did it stop? What was the date? Like an interrogation. I answered at first, then took offense. If you don't want to believe me, don't believe me. Who's forcing you? We didn't lie about mysticism in the 90s, but about guys. Another thing. But Misha's wife suddenly said, "Mishka, she doesn't know. It's obvious." And we told her that a girl, my peer, was killed 2 weeks ago in that front room where my dogman was. Only she wasn't like us, didn't socialize with hardly anyone. Always said hello politely, always walked around with a violin. She practiced music a lot, performed at competitions, very intelligent, wanted to enter the conservatory. She was still alive, so she crawled to the street, but there was no one there. She crawled to the place where my ghost stopped and died. Mishka goes to work early. He saw so much blood when the militia was there that now he meets and sees everyone off even in the daytime. A bright person died, her soul as white as snow. She wished the same death for no one.
Next story.
I was 7 years old at the time. It so happened that my parents were away for 2 days. I was an independent boy, so they were not worried about me in the slightest. There was food in the house, and I always had something to do. In case of emergency, I just had to go to the neighbor's house. Naturally, I was always walking outside. And once, I don't remember how it happened, I stayed out late in a yard 3 blocks away from mine. It was already very dark, and I had some kids with me that I met there. We sat and told each other all sorts of scary stories. It was scary, but we didn't show it in front of each other, of course. And then the first child was taken away by his parents, the second, the third. In the end, I was left sitting alone, and remembering all the scary stories told here. I was afraid to go home, especially since one of the stories was about my yard, and there was lightning and thunder in the distance. I just sat there and cried. Suddenly, a man of rather sturdy build came up to me and asked me what was wrong. I told him everything out of desperation, and he offered to walk me home. I realize now that I was an extremely naive child. We walked in the direction of my house. He asked me about my life, how I was studying, and everything else. That's how we got to my driveway. He said that if anything, he would stand at the front door for a while, and that if I was scared, I should just call out to him. When I got into the driveway, I heard the knock of a door closing somewhere and immediately ran out to the stranger. He offered to walk me to my apartment. We went up to my floor. I opened the door, turned on the light, and said goodbye to him. He said goodbye too and headed out. The next day, my parents came back. My father and I went for a walk. Our way lay just past the courtyard where the stranger approached me. Near one of the entrances stood a funeral procession of several people. On stools stood a coffin. A large photograph of the deceased was next to it. When I looked at the photograph, I was stunned. The stranger from yesterday was looking at me from there. Even assuming that he had died after seeing me off, there was no way he could have been buried the next day. My father also looked at the picture of the deceased and said, he was a good man. I knew him a long time ago. I am very grateful to my father's friend, and I often remember him. But I still can't understand how it happened. He just couldn't walk me home that dark night.
Next story.
I wanted to tell you a story that took place in my mother's life. And mine, of course. It happened a long time ago. I was in elementary school at the time. I will digress a little from the essence and tell a little about the character of my mom, which, however, partly passed to me, so to speak, by inheritance. We have one common trait. If we are sick, it is easier for us to be alone at that moment, and we endure to the last. This is not good, but to overcome yourself and call an ambulance earlier, not at the moment when you already realize that everything is sad. However, to each his own. Being a schoolgirl, I lived with my grandmother. My mother lived separately from us. I remember that evening very well. My grandmother and I were walking in the yard when I became wildly afraid. Although there was no reason for it, I burst into tears, and after much questioning I told her that my mother was dying. My grandmother calmed me down as best she could, but my hysteria did not end. At the same moment, my mom was squirming in pain on the couch in her apartment. Lucky for her, her aunt came in and managed to call an ambulance. I won't lie about what she had. I'm not a medical professional. Something female. A cyst wrapped around something or a rupture of some kind. But the point is, it was very serious, and she was on the operating table most of the night. I think everyone knows what clinical death is. The moment my mom's heart stopped, she saw her deceased friend who had died a few years earlier. When my mother told me about their conversation, I was very scared. She was complaining to her friend about life, saying that she was very tired and wanted to rest. My mother asked her to take her with her. I loved my mom's friend very much when she was alive. She was a wonderful person, and she remained that way after her death. She pushed my mom away, saying something like, "It's too early for you to be here. You have a daughter." After that push, according to my mom, she opened her eyes. A bunch of frightened doctors crowded around her. Later we checked the time. I will not say that second to second. However, at about that moment I calmed down. This is such a story. Instead of one, I managed to tell two, about family ties and real friends who help even when everything seems to be over.